several timekeepers. These are the clock.
Yeah, no, that's for us.
Internal.
Yeah, because then we know how long we can spend.
Okay. Right. Okay. So, are you ready to go? You want to get going?
Let's go.
Okay, hang on, just wait for you. Are you ready in the truck? Hello, Lars, are you ready? Okay, can we sit down?
And I'm going to give you some. It's going to be perfect. Don't you worry.
Okay.
1 second. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to our press conference, Women Leading a Fossil Fuel Phase-Out and a Just Transition. Women are going to end this era of fossil fuels. Let me just start that. My name is Osprey, Orielle, and I am the Executive Director of the Women's Earth and Climate Action Network, WECAN. And I want to begin by thanking our esteemed speakers for joining us today and for their vital leadership in the world. First, we're going to be hearing from Eriel Deranger. She is Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation, and she's Executive Director of the Indigenous Climate Action, which is in Canada. Then we'll be hearing from Dr. Amiera Sawas. She is Head of Research and Policy at the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And we are hoping to be joined by another colleague who I will introduce when she comes. Around the world, frontline women and global advocates are building critical strategies to end the era of fossil fuels and drive divestment from harmful extractive industries. We are here at this COP to demand justice and accountability from both financial institutions and governments. It's far past time for investments in global economies to shift towards a just transition, one that prioritizes people and planet over profit. And this is what we're struggling with here at COP29. Since the signing of the Paris Agreement, the world's 60 largest banks have funneled over $6.9 trillion into the fossil fuel industry. And meanwhile, the latest emissions gap report reveals our planet is on a trajectory to surpass 3 degrees of warning. To put it simply, this is a death sentence for millions and a disaster for every living being. In the face of these disastrous numbers, we demand that government leaders stand up to the fossil fuel industry instead of catering to them. And as some of you I'm sure have heard, there are over 1,700 fossil fuel lobbyists here at COP29. It's one of the largest delegations that's here. We must have real commitments from governments and financial institutions to phase out fossil fuels and invest in a just transition. This is an investment from death to life. Communities worldwide are organizing strategic campaigns to stop fossil fuel infrastructure, demand divestment, and halt extraction at its source. And at WECAN, we work from multiple angles to advance divestment and fossil fuel phase-out. And this includes meeting face-to-face with financial institutions, exposing injustices, and directly sharing how their fossil fuel financing violates human and Indigenous rights, while also driving climate disaster. This work is powerful, not only in securing divestment, but also in reclaiming spaces for women to seek justice and speak truth to power. To drive this transformation, we urgently need financial institutions and governments to stop the flow of money into fossil fuels and redirect investments towards renewable, regenerative energy solutions that respect human and Indigenous rights. At WECAN, we just released this report. It's our 4th edition, Gendered and Racial Impacts of the Fossil Fuel Industry and Complicit Financial Institutions. And this report highlights the intersections and of gender, race, and fossil fuel extraction, and the egregious health and safety impacts on women and communities of color, as well as widespread human and Indigenous rights violations. So we don't need to wait for any more to learn about the climate crisis coming. The fossil fuel industry has already been killing communities. In short, we see skyrocketing rates of cancer, asthma, and the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women, the fossil fuel industry is literally killing us right now. To genuinely address this crisis, we must overhaul the global economic system that perpetuates disaster capitalism, and our work calls for a regenerative, rights-based economy that centers community and nature. In this context, I also want to share WECAN's report on prioritizing how care work can unlock a just transition for all, which demonstrates how investing in high-quality care jobs can mitigate the worst impacts of the climate crisis, build up public infrastructure, and support economies within a just transition framework. So we have solutions from our communities, and we need governments to listen to these solutions. Our movement is calling not only for an immediate fossil fuel phase-out, but also stopping fossil solutions that don't work. This includes unproven technologies, carbon offset schemes, and net zero pledges that delay immediate action. So I have one more report I want to share with you, and I'm sharing a lot of reports because there's so much disinformation here, and there's so much information that is not leading us to a healthy future that we took the time to write these policy briefs, and we hope that you will read them and learn from them. This includes net zero pledges, as I mentioned, and at COP29, WECAN is releasing this policy analysis called The Need for Real Zero, Not Net Zero, Shifting from False Solutions to Real Solutions and a Just Transition, which details these critical issues. So we need to move swiftly, but we also have to move equitably with real solutions. And a key component of a real zero policy analysis is the need for a Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which you will be hearing about on this panel, which mandates a fast and fair fossil fuel phase-out, and we're honored to be on the steering committee of the treaty. And we need a fair, fast, funded, feminist, and complete fossil fuel phase-out, no more expansion of fossil fuels. And in light of this, it's critical to end fossil fuel subsidies and, I have to say, outsized military budgets that serve to perpetuate harm instead of directing funds towards a just transition. Let us be unequivocal. Carbon capture, geoengineering, carbon credits, and other market-based schemes are false solutions, and they delay real action and perpetuate climate injustice. We oppose Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. False solutions are loopholes allowing major polluters to greenwash their image without changing their practices, and we call for resources to go towards community-led solutions, not temporary fixes that only benefit a few. To achieve a just transition, we need feminist economic frameworks, and they have to be integrated across all sectors and all approaches. And women, particularly Indigenous, Black, and Brown women, are leading the way in climate solutions, and we must support the finance of their leadership. Governments upholding Indigenous rights and sovereignty in all environmental decision-making is also an essential implement of the just transition. Indigenous peoples have safeguarded ecosystems for generation, and their wisdom is central to real solutions, both in the fossil fuel phase-out and in designing just transition frameworks. So in conclusion, it is far past time to invest in the multitude of successful community-led solutions that take us away from a deadly extractive economy and that will instead guide us towards a healthy and equitable future. And I see, with all of the statistics that we have collected, that women are truly leading the way, and we need their leadership in this vital transformation. So thank you for listening to my comments. I hope you will look at our reports, and I would now like to hand the floor over to my colleague, Eriel Deranger. Thank you, Eriel.
Masicho Iklanete, Denesotlaneta, Eriel Tchekwie Hushe, Deranger Betsiini Hasli. My name, again, is Eriel Tchekwie Deranger. And I just want to give a little bit of context to where I come from as a start to all of this. My territories exist in what is known as the Peace Athabasca Delta, one of the last inland freshwater deltas in the world. It is recognized for its rich biodiversity as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and that UNESCO World Heritage Site, known as the Wood Buffalo National Park, is listed as under threat because of resource development, namely in the name of tar sands development or oil sands. Our lands and territories, which are home to our culture and our identity as Dene people, we are inseparable from these things. We are people that come from the caribou, from the bison, from the fish in our river systems, from the muskrat to the moose, to every animal that exists within our ecosystems. And when those animals and species and medicines and plants are under threat, so are we. So when we list this park as under threat, that means that our culture and who we are as Dene and Dene Sotlene people is also under threat. For over 60 years, the Alberta government and the Canadian government have sanctioned the destruction and degradation of our sacred landscapes for profits from the oil and gas sector. Despite the fact that Canada touts itself as a leader within the climate spaces, they are simply not. They are investing in pipeline corridors using public funds to deliver tar sands to international markets, again, allowing the sanctioning and the social license to develop these industries in our territories. My community has seen some of the most deep impacts of the fossil fuel industry, not just from the extraction, but also from the long-term cumulative impacts through cancers, autoimmune diseases, the degradation of the social fabric of our entire community. At the height of our challenges of the expansion of the tar sands in the early 2000s, when people didn't even know what I was talking about when I talked about tar sands and thought I was saying Tarzan, as in Tarzan and Jane, I would say tar sands. And I would bring this forward, and they didn't understand what was happening. And at that time, my community had nothing. We were not receiving any profits. We were not receiving any royalties from these projects. And the only way we received any benefit is if we could prove that we were harmed. Imagine that. Imagine having your entire ecosystem, your entire identity taken from you and destroyed in front of your eyes, and the only way you would see any kind of restitution is if you could go before a jury of people whose vested interest was in profits from oil and gas, was to tell them all the different ways you were harmed, and then they would decide if it was valid or not. This system still exists in Canada under the burden of proof remains in our community's hands to prove that we are harmed, and we have what are called impact benefit agreements, and that is how we receive benefit from this industry. At the same time, this industry is receiving billions of dollars in subsidies, trillions of dollars in subsidies globally for the multinational companies that are operating in my backyard. I have seen the disappearance and degradation of our waterways. Just this year, our water system was so low because of the massive amounts of water that they use that has been exacerbated by the climate crisis, to the point that our dock system that we rely on, because my community is a fly-in, remote community, and the only other way that's accessible is by boat, our dock no longer reached the water. And it gets worse because the industry contaminated the sediment in our ecosystem for so long that if we tried to extend the dock, we would agitate the petrochemicals that had landed in the settlement, and it would cause an environmental crisis. So the environmental crisis caused by the petro industry prevented us from being able to access our waterways so that we could continue to hunt, fish, and trap and access our own community. And we were told we could not do anything. These are the compounding impacts that we are seeing every single day. Every single day, our community is dealing with another case of cancer. While I was here, one of my cousins died. We don't know why. He just suddenly died. 3 years ago, one of my uncles also just died. Just keeled over and died one day. Government says things like, well, we don't know the cause. We just heard from a panel before us on the health impacts not being studied. Every time we talk about the deaths and the cancers in my community, they say it could have been your lifestyle choices. And again, this industry continues to receive billions of dollars in subsidies. And let's talk about the negotiations here. As Indigenous Peoples Movement, we have called out and decried the fallacies of the systems that are being created. The systems for international carbon markets under Article 6, the climate finance mechanisms that are only going to continue serving states to drive profits from false solutions, including technologies that are going to scrub the carbon out of the atmosphere. We used to see oil and gas lobbyists in high numbers, and now we're starting to see carbon market and carbon technology peddlers coming in to try to make profits off of the new climate finance mechanisms. Who deserves it the most? It's Indigenous peoples and those that have felt the impacts of the climate crisis, those that have felt the impacts of an overly funded oil and gas industry that should be receiving these benefits, not states that have allowed and sanctioned these projects to proliferate and destroy Indigenous communities and the most vulnerable. So let's talk about numbers that Osprey shared some of. Right now, we had a climate finance mechanism with a $100 billion commitment that's coming to an end. Of that $100 billion, only 3% went to projects serving Indigenous communities. Serving, not Indigenous-led, with less than 1% of that going directly to Indigenous communities. Of the Global Climate Fund that has been done in the last few years, only 0.1% of it went to women, and less to Indigenous women. We are now talking about the creation of a $1 trillion fund, and it is still putting state developed nation funding into developing nation state funds, and we are seeing the replication of systems of oppression to continue to proliferate. Where those funds will go into false solutions, to solutions that do nothing to change the realities of communities, that will do nothing to address the ongoing health crises that we are facing every single day. At the end of the day, we need direct financing to our community that is not reliant on false solutions and carbon markets. We need solutions where we get to design them, and we are funded directly from the Global Climate Fund, not the states deciding how we receive those funds. I've been given the zero, but I'm gonna embrace my Casey camp and say I will finish. I wanna end with one more thing. And I'm taking this from Casey. In my community, oil and gas in the oil sands was not something that was bad. The tar sands existed for many, many, many millennia. And our people used it to waterproof our boats, to waterproof the bottom of our shoes. And we had a sacred relationship with it. And colonizers came in and they perverted it, and they contorted it, and they ripped it out of the ground. An elder in my community said, why can't they just leave things alone? And they've taken it and they've perverted it so they can continue to make profits. And now we are seeing the same attempt of taking something that is good, our ecosystems and our landscapes, these so-called carbon markets, and perverting them into capitalist economic systems to allow them to continue to have power. We need to not just phase out of fossil fuels, we need to evaluate the systems that have allowed us to think that nature is ours for the taking and to pervert it to allow capitalism to proliferate this planet. We need real climate solutions driven by Indigenous and frontline communities and women. Thank you.
Amiera, please go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I'll try to keep my comments short so there's some time for questions. So I work for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty initiative. And I think it's important to say that fossil fuel emissions are actually projected to be about 8% higher this year than in 2015 when the Paris Agreement was signed. And 2024 is set to be the hottest year on record, so we can't forget the reality of the context we're in. But I'm not surprised by this, because for decades we've been talking about reducing emissions while building more and more fossil fuel infrastructure projects without actually dealing with the biggest driver of emissions, right? 86% or more of carbon in the atmosphere comes from fossil fuels. But about 80% of the population lives in countries that are net importers of fossil fuels. That's about 6 billion people who depend on them at the moment. For their lifestyles, for their consumption, for their economies. And this makes them very vulnerable to geopolitical shocks and stresses. And then we have low and middle income countries who are fossil fuel producers. They're locked into oil, gas, and coal extraction at the moment because they don't have other options. They're sort of being presented a limited box of options, which you can say is quite neoliberal and is sort of bracketing or holding this structural power in place at a geopolitical level. So we're not going to turn off the taps overnight, but we do have to stop making the problem bigger. It's not a transition, is it, if we're still growing the problem? Currently have about 110% fossil fuel production, extra fossil fuel production in place, planned, and that is actually compatible with 1.5 degrees, according to UNEP. So this is really, really hard, and hard things require honest conversations. They require honest conversations about how to unpack some of the barriers to the transition. And we have to be able to talk about fossil fuels, but it's been very, very difficult to talk about fossil fuels here. We need to talk honestly and openly and start to think about new solutions. And so that's what the Fossil Fuel Treaty proposal is trying to do. Currently, it's 14 high ambition nation states with a bold idea saying, let's come up with and work together on a legally binding treaty on phasing out fossil fuels in a way which is just and equitable in the context of the global economic and historic system. We've also been endorsed by 10 Indigenous nations, 4,000 civil society organizations, and almost 1 million people so far. And there are 3 key pillars, and I'll just be very short and speak on one of them, but they are to stop expanding the problem. That's the first one. Wind down fossil fuel production in a way and a timeline that's fair and equitable for different nations depending on their context, and ensure a just transition. And of course, a just transition actually has to be global. And so we have a report here which came out last week. If it's not global, it's not just. And what this is a mapping of all of the conversations of proposals around financing a just transition. Because when we talk to governments, they tell us they're not opposed to transitioning away from fossil fuels, but for many governments across the global south, they need the financial support to do that. And you'll know from being in this space that there's a very weak commitment of historically responsible states to actually commit to financing, right? To commit to financing. And so we need to actually be having innovative forms of cooperation that can channel that. So this report maps all the proposals that are out there and talks about which ones of those proposals related to debt, related to capital costs, which are deeply unfair across the global south, and related to how to actually replace fossil fuel export revenues on which many producer and consumer countries are reliant upon. So happy to talk about any of those mechanisms and what we're proposing as an initiative. Thank you. But I also just want to say, as a sort of person of a feminist research background, you know, the evidence is very clear why we need women's leadership in the just transition. You know, climate impacts are not only massively gendered, there's a lot of evidence on that I can talk about, but climate solutions are also gendered. And so we've had the Lima work program on gender here for over a decade. And yet, despite some of it being very basic in the beginning about women's representation in these talks, we've only had a 3% increase at the political level in 10 years. So if that tells you who's making the decisions, it's largely men. But also the fossil fuel industry and the energy sector are inherently patriarchal, right? They reinforce the patriarchal division of labor. The fossil fuel sector has traditionally had the lowest percentage of women employees, especially in managerial positions of any sector in the world. And currently across the 500 biggest energy companies, 18.5% only women executive officers, so leaders. So we also need, and we appreciate you coming to this press conference because we need people to be listening to women who are generating those solutions as well, because we're not listened to enough, and therefore we have solutions which actually exclude women at multiple scales and with multiple intersectionalities. This is about the knowledge we generate too, it's about the solutions we put forward. So we're working with feminist organizations, for example, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. They've done some very interesting analysis on the money. Because of course there's all this debate about there's no money. How can we have a just transition? There's no money. they've done some analysis on military spending and found that if just 5% of global military spending had been diverted on an annual basis over the last 10 years, there would have been $110 billion available a year, just 5%. So we would have met the climate finance goal very easily. Military spending has grown for the 9th consecutive year globally. So it's about priorities, it's about where the money is being channeled, and as women, we're willing to basically have those hard conversations. So really happy to take more questions or talk more about the Fossil Fuel Treaty, but I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, and we will definitely take any questions from the audience. And I just wanted to say also how important it is we don't have time to go into an analysis about why we're talking about women. Just to give you one stat, there is something called the Women's Political Empowerment Index, and it shows that with just a 1-unit increase in any country, the Women's Political Empowerment Index, you see an 11.51% decrease in carbon emissions, just from the fact of women being engaged and women being given social status and being engaged in having agency in their communities. So we're not just talking that it is morally correct for women to be leading. The fact is we are leading the way, and we need to be given a lot more funding. We need to be listened to. And there was a study, I think it was from the last COP, that showed 77% of the speaking time at the COP is done by men. So we have to also change this dynamic to also get to the root causes of the climate crisis and how we're going to resolve this. Are there any questions from the audience? Okay, because our time is so valuable, I would like to just give us all...
2 sentences?
Everybody gets 2 sentences to close out.
There's no climate action without women and without Indigenous peoples and human rights.
Agree. And there's no just transition if it's not a global one. So the Just Transition Work Programme here, the elements of international cooperation and actionable outcomes are absolutely critical. And so in all of the conversations that you have, I hope that you share that message. Thank you.
Can I add one last thing? Check out the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion. Indigenous rights are truly leading the way, and you'll notice that those panels are loaded with Indigenous women.
So what we'd like to do in closing is just encourage people that while we're here, because we all really care, and we're here at these COP processes trying to intervene and make things as best as we can, the fact is there's all of our social movements, all of our movements working in many diverse ways, building a just transition, having Indigenous solutions, having women leading the way, that are really efforting outside of these spaces, but we're also wanting to influence these spaces. But it's really important for people to understand there's a very different narrative and a very different approach that's looking at false solutions, that's looking at real solutions, and we need to keep communicating with one another, because what is happening here is not working. It's taking us off a cliff, and so we need to really ensure that we learn from one another, educate one another, share information, and support one another. Thank you. Thank you so much.